Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sanctified Sisters of Colesville presentation. We're joined with our host, Julianne Mangin, from Montgomery History Speakers Bureau and former librarian for 30 years with the Library of Congress. Please remain muted during the presentation, and there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. You can also put questions in the chat, and we can read them off for you when the time comes. So, Julianne, whenever you're ready, you can begin.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I actually was a librarian at Library of Congress for 14 years, and before that, I spent about the same amount of time at the National Agricultural Library. Oh, look,
Okay.
Ralph Buglass wants to come in.
There's Ralph.
Good. I didn't know that was the Ralph you were referring to.
Yes.
So I'll wait to, is he in? Because I don't want to exclude him.
I'm here.
There he
Hi,
is.
Ralph.
Hello.
Oh, good to see you, Ralph. So, just about to get underway. So, what I'd like to do is talk to you about the forgotten history of Commonwealth Farm. Oh, you know what I should do? I should share my screen. I knew there was something I'd forgotten to do. Okay. Da, 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 da. From beginning. There we go. Okay, so like I said, I wanted to talk to you all about the forgotten history of Commonwealth Farm in Colesville. And it was owned by a woman's commune that was first known as the Sanctified Sisters and later as the Woman's Commonwealth of Washington, D.C. And they were formed in Texas around 1875 and moved to Washington, D.C. in 1898. In 1903, they bought property out in Colesville and they named it Commonwealth Farm. And then a couple years later, in 1905, they opened a restaurant and an inn there that became a popular place for motorists in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And then finally, in 1947, there were only two members left, and the property was sold. And since then, the property's changed hands several times, and it's now a county park. Now, the Women's Commonwealth of Washington was a remarkable group of Texas women who generated a fair amount of press for being independent of men at a time when that was nearly unheard of. So it's interesting to wonder, what about Montgomery County did they find appealing, and, Colesville in particular. But before we get into that story, I'd like to, let's see, there we go. I'd like to talk to you about how I got interested in this. And like a lot of pet projects in the past couple of years, blame it on the pandemic. So it was December 2020, and I was reading this Facebook group that's devoted to Wheaton, Maryland, and somebody posed the question, does anybody know the story behind this retaining wall that you see on New Hampshire Avenue when you're going north and you're just about to get to Good Hope Road? And some people in the group knew that it used to be a nursing home that had a terrible fire in the 1950s, but there was one person in the group who knew that it used to be a restaurant because his mother had been a waitress there. And the way he put it, he was told that it was run by something called the Commonwealth, which was a group of old people that banded together for the common good. So, and I read that and I was fascinated with the idea of people getting together and helping each other in their old age. So I started researching it. So the first thing I did was I went to there's something called the Atlas of Montgomery County, Maryland, which is basically a real estate map. And I did find this piece of land, and it's got a couple boxes that indicate, those are buildings, some kind of structures. There's a U-shaped driveway, and there were the words Commonwealth Farm Inn. And the other thing it told me was that the property was owned by Peter Floros. So then I went to the Montgomery County land records, and I found that he had bought the property in 1948 or 47 And he had bought it from a group called the Woman's Commonwealth of Washington, which had owned it since 1903. So then I had some keywords to work with, Commonwealth Farm and Woman's Commonwealth of Washington. So then I started searching all kinds of sources, and I tried to find newspaper articles, photographs, books, land records, deeds, anything that I could find about it. And so this is what I came up with. And so let's start with how the Commonwealth started. And it was founded by Martha McWhirter. She was born Martha White in 1827 in Tennessee. And then in 1845, she married George McWhirter. And in 1855, they moved to Bell County, Texas. And then in 1865, they moved to the town of Belton, which is the seat of Bell County. And then while they were in Belton, they started the Union Sunday School, which was non-denominational, and it taught to all the Protestant denominations because at that time, Belton, there were no dedicated church buildings in Belton. So that's what they did. And also Martha would teach like prayer groups in various people's homes. Then in 1870, the Methodist Church they finally built their own church, and they started their own Sunday school just for Methodists. And even though George and Martha were Methodists themselves, they objected to the idea of just teaching to one denomination. So it was kind of the beginning of their parting of the ways with the Methodist Church. Now here's some events that happened that precipitated the formation of the Sanctified Sisters. And the first one was that Martha had a revelation in 1866 that she was sanctified, and also that it was wrong to divide Christianity into separate denominations. And around 1875, she became dissatisfied with her, she became estranged from George, partly because he didn't share her beliefs about sanctification, but also, she objected to the kind of control that he had over the family purse strings. And the story goes that one day she came to him and asked him for $1.50 so she could buy herself a new pair of slippers. And he balked at giving her the money and asked her, do you really need them? And she was like, that's it. I'm never asking you for any money for myself or the children. Anything that I need for us, I'm going to get out of my own money from the cows and chickens that I raise, and selling the eggs and milk and so forth. And of course, it was more a matter of that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Because if you think back at what I said before, that they moved to Bell County, Texas in 1855. And in those days, it was pretty much a frontier. There wasn't anything there. So for them to, start a family and a farm and everything, Martha had to work just as hard as George, build a house, start a farm, keeping house, raising the children and all that. And then in addition, when the Civil War broke out, George decided that he needed to join the Confederate Army, and he was gone for a while, leaving Martha to run everything. So I think you can understand why she, took offense at being asked to justify buying herself a nice pair of slippers. So, but finally, another thing that happened that started the commune was the fact that she went to her prayer group, which made up of women mostly, who shared her points of view, and she talked about her problems with her marriage, and she found out that other women in the group had similar problems with their husbands or other problems like drunkenness, physical abuse, or desertion. So here are the main beliefs of her prayer group, and in around 1875, it was really starting to evolve into this communal situation. So their main belief is in sanctification, which the way I understand it, it's the dedicating yourself to God and to living a life without sin. And then there was also her belief in non-sectarianism. She, like I said, she believed that it was wrong to divide Christianity into multiple, denominations. But she was also said to, she disdained organized religion. She preferred to read the Bible herself and come to her own conclusions about what it meant. And she also relied on her own, like revelations and things that came to her in dreams that she believed came to her from God. And she was quoted or once as saying something to the effect of that she believed that theologians were the source of a great deal of the evil and unhappiness in this world. So, and then finally, celibacy. And it didn't start out as being celibate, but effectually it happened that way. But she believed that it was wrong for a person who was sanctified to be married to someone who was not sanctified. So that led to the end of her marriage and also the marriages of other women in the group. And one by one, they broke off from their marriages and joined this commune. And some of them even brought, their children with them into the commune. And now by 1879, they were pretty much self-supporting, and whatever money they raised, they put into a communal pot to support, the entire commune. And they did things like they cut and sold firewood, they wove rugs and sold them. They opened a commercial laundry. One of the women taught herself dentistry, and another learned how to make shoes. So they were, trying to be self-sufficient. And a home that was owned by one of the members became one of the communal homes for what was called the Sanctified Sisters. And it later became the basis of their main business, which was the Central Hotel of Belton. Now, on the surface, it might seem like they formed a religious commune. But when you think about it, it was formed because of their dissatisfaction with traditional marriage and also organized religion. And so it could be kind of thought of as a feminist commune because both those organizations were dominated by men, so they were rebelling against that. And some of the women in the group were fleeing domestic violence, so the commune became like an early form of a shelter for battered women. And finally, it was a financial or an economic commune meant to solve a problem for women. And that was that usually when women got divorced, they found themselves in a lesser financial situation than they had been when they were married. But this was not true of the Sanctified Sisters. Now, this is a picture of the McWhorter House in Belton, Texas. And after George went off to live somewhere else, it became it became another one of the communal homes that they used for their organization. Now, the community of Belton was hostile towards them, one for their unorthodox religious views, but also because of all the marriages that were broken up because of the commune. And churches turned them out and accused them of heresy. I'm sure Martha McWhorter didn't care because she already knew that she knew better than all of them anyway. One woman was taken out of the commune by her family and put in an insane asylum. There were two men who were boarders in this house, and but they supported the Sanctified Sisters. And one day a mob showed up and they went in the house, dragged the two men out and beat them up. But another thing that the community members would do against the sisters was they would see people who looked like travelers, people from out of town, on the street looking for a place to stay, and they would accost them and say terrible things about the Central Hotel. But enough people got to the hotel anyway, and they were able to build a reputation for hospitality and fine food. So, despite the hostilities that they endured, they persisted in their religious and financial endeavors. And they did things like they gave money to the railroad to try to get it to send a spur out to Belton, which, would obviously benefit their business, but it would benefit all the businesses in town. They also financed an opera house, and they started the first public library in Belton. And they were very successful at what they did, and they became so successful that in 1894, Martha McWhirter was invited to join the Belton Board of Trade. So articles about the commune appeared in newspapers all over the country because basically a group of women living on their own without men telling them what to do was fascinating material. So here's some examples that I found. This one's from Butte, Montana. Direct from the devil. That's from Fort Worth. And then there's this one also from Minnesota, St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, the thing is that the Sanctified Sisters membership peaked at 50 in about 1880. So it's really amazing for such a small organization to get so much national attention. So around 1898, they began to divest their Texas holdings so that they could move to Washington, D.C. And interestingly, the community that once had been hostile to them tried to get them to stay, but they'd made up their minds, so off they went. And they were attracted to Washington because of its cultural opportunities, but also because it was a beautiful city. And the aging first generation was looking for a cooler climate than Texas. And they also hoped that being in Washington would ease the restlessness of the second generation of commune members who were mainly children and mainly girl children who were growing up, and they had never really chosen to be a member of this commune. It was, a choice their mothers made. So at this point, there were 23 members of the group, and they bought this large house in the Mount Pleasant neighborhood of Washington, D.C. Now, the lot was about 2/3 of an acre, and it was large enough for them to build put a small garden in it, and the Washington Post called it a tiny farm. And they also had cows. Imagine that today, cows in Mount Pleasant, Washington. But anyway, in their leisure time, they would read, paint, they would do needlework, they would observe sessions of Congress and go to libraries and museums. And another thing that they did, they had this big house, and they would invite people to come give lectures at their house, people who had issues that they had in common, including women's suffrage and socialism. In 1903, they formed a constitution that expressed their common values. So the first thing that it did was it established the official name as the Woman's Commonwealth of Washington. Now, they never liked the name Sanctified Sisters, which was actually a name that was, put on them by outsiders. And they had always just referred to their group as the church, and they called each other sister. But they also, had the property and assets were all owned in common, and they divided the labor equally. They all had to agree to be governed by a board of directors and a board of trustees, and they had to take a vow of celibacy. So here's some more articles. When they moved to Washington, even back then, I'm sure there was just a whole lot more journalism going on there. So they began to get a new round of attention and news articles. So I found these. They're slightly kinder than the early ones. This one's from Franklin, Louisiana. And this is Washington Times, and this is from the New York Sun. And this is my favorite article that I saw written about them, because not just the content of the article, it's got this beautiful Art Nouveau layout that they did for it. But the press coverage kind of turned negative when one of the younger members of the commune decided to leave to get married. And this article is very sensationalistic, and they, decide that their vow of celibacy means they're a bunch of man haters. And in fact, it's probably too tiny for you to see, but the caption to the picture of the house here says, "The house of the man haters." Ooh. And then one of the young ladies in the commune decided to get a federal government job, and then word got out that she belonged to a commune of celibate women. So of course the paper got wind of it. So the Washington Post and the Washington Times both covered this story, but it's strikingly different in the way they did it. This is the Washington Post, and I mean, it just appears relatively benign. It's just reporting the facts. And then there's the Washington Times. Oh, Washington's sanctified sisterhood invades the government service. Get married to a man, never, nothing but celibacy for the women of this sect. So there you go. Now, here's point in the story where we get to Colesville. So in 1903, they purchased a 119 acres from Charles Collingrew in Colesville, and they called it Commonwealth Farm. So here's a detail from an 1894 map of the area, and just so you know what this is showing. So this says this vertical road here is called Ashton and Colesville Pike. It's now known as New Hampshire Avenue. And this road coming in from the west and hitting the pike at this sharp angle, that is Bonifant Road. And then on the other side of the intersection, going back up at a different sharp angle, this is Good Hope Road. So the area that they bought was down into this intersection, and then kind of up around here. That's the property that they own. And just so you know, this church here and the school here, that's an indication that this was an area that also had an African-American community in the vicinity of where they bought their property. And it was called Good Hope. But as far as I can tell, there was really not much interaction or any interaction with the Commonwealth Sisters. Now here's a current map of this area, and you can see this is the old Bonifant Road, and this road here is what used to be Good Hope Road. But the road was rerouted because obviously this is a really dangerous shape for an intersection. So it was rerouted. So on this map, you can see that the southern part of their farm has got development on it, and it goes up this area, and there's a piece of it north of Good Hope Road. It's all around there. And this area up here has become Peachwood Neighborhood Park. And this is also parkland, which I'll get into more later. So another thing that'll help you visualize this is some aerial photographs. Now this is one from, let's see, this thing is, the controls are covering up my screen, but I believe it says 2019. 2017, okay, good thing I got notes. Anyways, you can see there's still that development on the bottom, but in the southern portion of it, but there's still, all this is, it's wooded, it's undeveloped, it's interesting. And here is an aerial photo from 1951. And you can see the same area is almost all agricultural fields. And this is the area, this cluster right here is where the inn and the restaurant were. So the remaining women, I'm sorry. So the remaining members of Women's Commonwealth, they seem more comfortable in a rural setting, because remember, they all came from Texas when it was mostly a frontier. And so Martha McWhirter especially, she was delighted with it. And they raised pigs and chickens and cows and ducks and livestock, but they also obviously did a lot of farming. There were wheat fields, they grew grass, they had corn. At one point, there were 1,000 fruit-bearing trees there. So they produce a lot of food and dairy products, as someone mentioned earlier. And what they did was they had a wagon and they would sell produce locally, but they also used the wagon to drive food down to DC because they still owned the house in Mount Pleasant and some of the sisters lived there. And so that's how they supplied food for both their own restaurant at Commonwealth Farm and the home in Washington. So like as I said, so it was 1905, like 2 years after they bought this property was when they opened the restaurant. Now they were mentioned in this report called A Rural Survey in Maryland, and it was commissioned by something called the Montgomery County Country Life Committee. Not sure exactly what the purpose was, and it gives the impression that it's about the whole state of Maryland, but it's really just, excuse me, it's really just about Montgomery County. So there's this brief mention, and item 7, but the one that gets me at the end is it is rumored that they get on entirely without masculine counsel and assistance. Imagine that. So Martha McWhirter died at the farm in 1904, and there were a lot of people, outsiders, who believed, well, once she's gone, that's the end of the commune. But it wasn't, because they had all signed on to this Constitution and they were bound by its terms. So the Commonwealth endured after her death, but its numbers did dwindle a bit, and there are a few reasons for that. One is they didn't recruit new members, they didn't proselytize, and also I think celibacy had something to do with it. And then the second thing was that the younger generation was disenchanted with all the restrictions of the commune. And to be honest, some of the adult, first generation members, I believe, were unhappy but the younger generation especially, because by coming to Washington, D.C., they became aware of the possibilities of, a higher education and careers outside the home. And then some of them wanted to get married and have children, and others, felt, well, they should be able to control their own money, which obviously those two things were not allowed by the Constitution. So by 1908, there were only 9 members left, and those were Margaret Henry and Emily McEwen, Fanny and Lizzie Holtzclaw, who were sisters, and Gertrude Schiebel and her daughter Martha, and then Josephine Rancier and Leila Carter. And in 1918, they sold a house in Washington, and from that point on, the entire Commonwealth lived together at Commonwealth Farm in Colesville. So in the early 1920s, as people began to have cars, Commonwealth Farm became one of the places that people might drive, if they wanted to go motoring in the countryside. And its clientele included, influential Washingtonians and members of high society. And so glowing descriptions of the farm began to appear in society columns. So, for example, there was a meeting of congressional wives in 1922, and it was reviewed in the Evening Star, and this is what they said. Commonwealth Farm was called, quote, a delightful old-fashioned country place near Silver Spring, Maryland, with broad grassy slopes and beautiful large trees. And here's another one, and this is quite a run-on sentence, but it's very descriptive. The table set under the trees and fairly groaning under the load of toothsome old Maryland dishes, such as fried chicken and cream gravy, cornbread, tall pitchers of creamy buttermilk, and such ice cream as one seldom tastes, was a picture long to be treasured. And the farm was also a place where people would go to escape the heat of the city. So there was this item. Mrs. Harold is spending summer out at the farm, a lovely old place on the Silver Spring Road where lunches or chicken dinners are served on order and which is becoming exceedingly popular with motor parties. So I did find names of a couple of organizations that met there occasionally for luncheons. One was the Women's Auxiliary of the Order of the Eastern Star. And then there was a group called the Massachusetts Society of Washington. I don't know what that means. And then, of course, there was the Board of Directors of the Central Savings Bank. And I also learned that there were some famous visitors. It said that Eleanor Roosevelt went there, and Clifford Berryman, the cartoonist, and Sam Rayburn, Speaker of the House, and Fred Vinson, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So then in 1927, they put this ad in the paper they were going to sell. It has a detailed description of the farm, though, which is really great. 20-room house, 4 baths, and acres of wheat and corn and all that. But in the fine print, it also says, there was a summer cottage, and they talked about, what livestock went with the property, and even some of the amenities, like it had a ice box that could hold a ton of ice. So that was pretty amazing. So at the time that this ad was placed, there were only 5 members of the Commonwealth left, and 3 of them were in their 70s. So it would be understandable that they might want to retire. But for whatever reason, the sale didn't take place, and they remained in Colesville. But I'm just really grateful that I came across this ad, because there's very little that has this detailed a description of what that place must have been like. So Commonwealth Farm went on, continued through the 1930s and well into the 1940s. In 1940, Josephine Rancier died, and that left just 2 members left, and that was Leila Carter and Martha Schiebel. Now, the year before Rancier died, the Commonwealth had sold off an 11.5-acre tract on the north side of the farm. But when after Rancier's death in about 1945, they bought it back so that Carter and Schiebel could build a house there. And then they lived on that 11.5-acre tract, and they sold the rest. And that was in 1946. So that's when the farm was sold to Peter and Vivian Floros, and they tried to keep the restaurant going. And I believe that this postcard, which shows what it looked like, was done during their era. But then it only stayed open until September of 1947, and then they were out of business. So what happened after the Floros sold it? They closed the restaurant and they sold the property, and they sold it to Jessie Jolliffe. And Jessie Jolliffe was she owned two nursing homes, actually, one in Tacoma Park and one in Silver Spring. And what she did was she sold both of them, bought Commonwealth Farm, and then she placed this ad in the paper, and she was soliciting for reservations at her new nursing home in Colesville. And she got a permit from the county, and they had her install fire escapes. So she ran this business, the nursing home, for a couple of years, and then this happened. On September 18, 1951, a fire broke out in the north wing of the nursing home, and that wing was completely burned out, and then the fire jumped to the main building and burnt 6 more rooms there. And when the firemen arrived, they weren't immediately able to fight the fire, because they had to evacuate all the patients, many of whom were frail, and there were some that were kind of confused. And when the firemen, turned their back on them. They tried to go back into the building. There was one patient, and she actually fought off her rescuers because she said she wanted to retrieve her favorite chair. And unfortunately, she died in the fire sitting in her favorite chair. So in all, 4 people died and 47 people were injured. And the cause was suspected to be somebody like threw a lit cigarette or emptied an ashtray near a linen closet. Now, 2 months after the fire, though, Jessie Jolliffe got the place fixed back up and she was cleared to open, and she fully reopened the nursing home after that short period of time, and it stayed open until at least through the end of 1953. Now, the question is, how did this property go from a nursing home to a county park? I'll just give you a quick timeline of the changes. So in 1955, Jessie Jolliffe sold the property to a Harry Gorin, who I believe was a developer or maybe an investor of some kind. The next year after that sale, Leela Carter died, so Martha Schiebel became the last living member of the Commonwealth. In the 1960s, I'm not sure when, that's when the buildings were torn down. In 1971, Harry Gorin sold it to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, I've been told recently that because we know that the Seventh-day Adventist Church does have a headquarters somewhere up 29 or something. But anyway, apparently back in the 70s when they were trying to find a place, they bought up a lot of properties, and this may have been one of them. And then when they decided not to use it, that's why it never got developed, because they chose that other location. Now, 1988 was when Bonifant and Good Hope roads were realigned to the north, and in doing that, they ran Good Hope Road between the main part of Commonwealth Farm to the south of Good Hope Road, and then that piece that 11.5 acre piece that Martha Schiebel lived on was north of this new Good Hope Road. So the next thing that happened was then the Seventh-day Adventists sold the land to a group of investors. Sometime in 1999, the property was subdivided into 2 tracts. And the reason I think that happened was because the county had its eye on the property. They wanted to buy it, but they didn't want to make the whole purchase in one budget year. So if they subdivided it, they could buy it in 2 halves. And the only proof I have of that, it just makes sense, but both purchases happened on June 30th, which is the last day of the county government's fiscal year. So the first tract was sold June 30, 2000, and the second tract was sold June 30, 2001. Now, what surprises me so much about this chain of events is during all this time, so much of that property never got developed. It's just kind of amazing when you think about what Montgomery County looks like now. And that property is now part of Upper Paint Branch Stream Valley Park. So this photo I took here, I was standing roughly where the inn was, looking towards New Hampshire Avenue, and you know, there's this retaining wall that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, and that's the First Alliance Church that's right across the street from them. And all around this area, you can find brick and stone and concrete foundations and walls and stuff like that are, you know, evidence of where this inn used to be. Now, the park property is undeveloped, and there are no trails and no amenities. So it's okay to visit it, but you do it at your own risk because, like I said, there's no trails, and there's a pull off of Good Hope Road that isn't very well developed either. And so I visited this property in the winter, as you can see, and I could walk around fairly freely, but I did go back there once in the summer, and it's like, hey, you know, it was just so overgrown, you wouldn't even want to try it. So this is Martha Schiebel's house. which is just north of Good Hope Road there. And that's part of that 11.5 acre tract that the Commonwealth kept. The Commonwealth now being Martha Schiebel. But later it was subdivided like in 1993, and the county used the remainder of that. Well, Martha's piece remained 2.75 acres, and then the remaining part became Peachwood Neighborhood Park. Now, Martha Schiebel spent the rest of her life in this house on this land that once was Commonwealth Farm, and she lived frugally and she took in boarders. And when she died in 1983 at the age of 100, the Commonwealth assets were worth $250,000, which is roughly the equivalent of $700,000 in today's money. And in keeping with the Commonwealth's Constitution, the assets were left to the Washington City Orphans Asylum, which is now known as Hillcrest Children and Family Center. So now the question is, why did Commonwealth Farm become so forgotten? And I believe one of the reasons is that by the time they got to Colesville, first of all, there weren't that many of them left. But secondly, I think they all had become very weary of the way they were treated in the press, and so they decided to keep a low profile. And actually, you know, that report called the Rural Survey in Maryland from 1912, that is the latest mention I was able to find of them as a commune in print until well after they died out. So it became a secret. Now, many of the members of the Commonwealth are buried at Rock Creek Cemetery, and they're in section F, which is down here. And actually, when I've gone there, it's kind of where the top of the F is here. When Josephine Rancier died in 1940, there wasn't any more room for her in their plot, so she's actually buried at Union Cemetery in Burtonsville, Maryland. So the Commonwealth Farm was a refuge for a group of independent women at a time when society looked down on their aspirations for self-determination and the right to vote, and they were criticized and called a group of man-haters. And there was one article I read that really annoys me because it called their interest in suffrage as a hobby. Nevertheless, they persisted. And while it's sad that the commune, you know, met its end, it's not. I don't think you should look upon the Commonwealth as having failed, because they really never aspired to be a great membership organization. And given their celibacy, you know, it was gonna die out. But they managed to form an extended family based on their common values, and they live life on their own terms, and I think that's something to be admired. So before I end, though, I just wanted to talk about this book. This is the only book I've found that exists. I'm pretty sure it is the only one. That's a picture of Our Ladies. This book was written in 1993, and it's entirely about the Woman's Commonwealth of Washington. And the title, This Strange Society of Women, of course, taken from an article by, you guessed it, the Washington Times. And the author, Sally Kitch, is a professor of women and gender studies at Arizona State University. But the interesting thing to me was in this introduction, she explains this. She actually grew up in Montgomery County. And she was researching an earlier book about celibate communes, one of which was the Commonwealth. And she just found out that they had bought property in Colesville. So she contacted her mother, who was still living in Montgomery County, and asked her to go to the courthouse and, you know, find out anything she can about Martha McWhirter or the Woman's Commonwealth. And as luck would have it, the clerk that she met at the courthouse said, "Oh, I know all about that. I have a friend who's renting a room from Martha Schiebel." which was a a wonderful coincidence. So she connected Dr. Kitch with this boarder who connected her with Martha Schiebel, and she was able to interview her just 2 months before she died, which was kind of a really good fortune. So then she decided to write a whole book about the Commonwealth, which is this one. And as she's wrapping up her research, she decides, well, maybe I should touch base with this boarder of Martha's. And she did, and asked, did Martha leave behind any papers? And he said, oh, he says, mounds and mounds of them. And it was like boxes of, letters and deeds and photographs and receipts and all kinds of great stuff. And basically, I can tell you, a researcher's dream come true. And he mailed it all to her, and she used it to write this book. And then when she was done, all those papers were donated to the University of Texas at Austin. So in this book, it does talk a little bit about Commonwealth Farm, but not as much in as much detail as I just gave you. But her interest was in the feminist theory behind the commune, and my interest is, what's its place in Montgomery County history. But I did enjoy reading the book. It's quite academic, so some of it went over my head a little bit, but I got a sense of, the motivations and, of the sisters and why this was important to them. And I'm really quite grateful to Dr. Kitch for keeping their memory alive so that I could do this talk. So that's all I've got, and I'm happy to take questions however you want to do that.
Well, thank you so much for that. It was a really great presentation.
Well, thank you.
If anybody would prefer to put questions in the chat instead of just speaking, that's fine. You can do that. And there is one question in there asking if the Mount Pleasant House still exists.
Unfortunately, no. The thing is that the address that they had for it was 1437 Kennesaw Avenue, and then I looked on a map and there isn't one. But then I later found out that was renamed Irving Street.
Oh, okay.
And then yeah, it was torn down a long time ago, and it's a shame because it wasn't that a fascinating looking building.
It was a beautiful home.
Looked like it, yeah, and they could afford the best. I mean, they, like I said, it's amazing. These women were quite, especially Martha McWhirter, was quite good with money.
Julianne, it's been a really professional presentation. I missed the very first couple of minutes. Are you an historian? Is that?
No, I mean, I'm an amateur historian, but I had my 30-year career with government libraries, gave me the ability to do the research. Although I like to tell people, for 30 years, I went and found stuff for people that were, they were researching a topic, but I didn't have to read any of it, So I was like I'd find the stuff and I go, here, read it. Well, now this has been an interesting experience in the last several years of doing my own research, but also, doing all that reading and trying to make something out of it that you can pass on to other people.
That's fantastic. Are you planning on putting this in a book?
Oh, no.
No?
No.
Well,
No,
I do have one. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I do have one question about Martha McWhirter. Was she the only one who considered she was sanctified? So sanctification was not really a prerequisite to join. Is that correct?
No, I think they all believed that they were sanctified. But I think she's the one that brought that concept to them through the prayer group. I mean, I can't be positive not having been there, but they did all share that belief in sanctification and that they were sanctified.
But then some of them wanted to leave at some point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah, I know. I'll tell you something really funny. Now, Martha Schiebel, who was the last living member of it, apparently when she was a young woman, in around 1900, 1901, she left and went lived in Ohio for somewhere, but she came back after Martha McWhirter died, which
Oh,
makes me
interesting.
think
Uh-huh.
Martha McWhirter may have been quite a force to deal with, and Martha
Right.
Siebel was
Oh.
like, I'll wait till she's, I don't
Right.
know. I can't
Right.
read her mind, but it's certainly an interesting coincidence that, and she had been named after Martha McWhirter too, which is kind of
Oh,
interesting
that's
because
kind
she
of,
was
yeah.
pretty
Hmm.
much an infant
Oh,
at the time, you know. I mean, she may actually have been born after her mother joined that. I'm not sure.
hmm.
I'll have to go look at the time, look at the times again. But anyway, that's my anecdote about her.
Right. Right. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
I have two questions. But
Sure.
first, Julianne's being far too modest. She's a fabulous researcher, and she worked at the Library of Congress, so that tells you something also. And I've heard her talk at least 2 times now because it's just so interesting. Do you have any desire to, would you like to meet Sally Kitch, the author of the book? Or do you want to go to read those papers at the University of Texas at Austin?
Well, the researcher in me wanted to hop a plane as soon as I heard about them. But the pandemic made it really hard for research. I mean, anything that was online was great. But like, for example, I wanted to find out what shape the papers were in and if they'd been digitized. But at that time, they weren't even allowing people into the buildings at the University of Texas. So there was nobody to answer my questions or nobody go look at the condition of the collection and all that. And of course, I wasn't going to get on a plane and I couldn't get into the archive anyway. So I did at the time, I would have done it. I did correspond with Sally Kitch.
Ah.
And she was unaware of the whole restaurant operation. I mean, I think she knew there was one, but she didn't realize that that piece of land that Martha was on was just a small sliver of what the farm used to be. And I'm not sure I can't remember from our conversations, but I explained to her that the restaurant was down the road a piece. Did that answer your question?
Oh, yes.
Well,
And now that the pandemic's over, would you be interested in going to see the papers?
I might. I've actually moved on to other things. I know,
That's just
Sarah.
what I was going to say. She's on to other projects now.
Yeah, one of my first projects was a genealogy and my own genealogy, but then I got interested in, as we discussed earlier, the Aspen Hill Pet Cemetery, and the historian for the oldest pet cemetery in the United States actually lives in Austin. So I could have gone and like killed 2 birds with 1 stone, but right now, I don't see it in my immediate future. But if I find myself in Texas, I might do it.
That's good. Any other questions from anyone? I'm happy to read them if you want to post them.
Oh, were there any more? Oh, there. I don't see any.
No, nobody has posted any. So
Okay, well, I'm going to stop the share so I can. Whoa, there you are. Oh no, is my screen doing that crazy thing?
No, it looks okay for us. Just for
Okay, I
you,
got
I
it.
think.
I've got a laptop that I think its monitor is just about to go.
all right. Well, thank you
Sadly.
again for being here and doing this for us. It was a really great presentation, and
Oh,
we'd
thank
love to
you.
have you back again sometime.
Sure.
So if there's no other questions, I just want to let everyone know if you enjoyed this presentation, we do have other events that you can find on our website, poolsvilleseniors.org. We have croquet this Sunday at 1 o'clock at Linden Farm. There's a really great speaker coming to discuss European travel planning. And that's going to be a Zoom event on the 6th. And then we'll have Brad Stone back with us, who's been very popular doing naval medicine during the Civil War on April 11th. So definitely register for some other events. So if you'd like to unmute now and you can thank Julianne, and thank you for coming.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank you.
Julianne. That was a
Thank
wonderful
you.
presentation.
Very good.
Well,
Thank
thank
you
you.
so
And
much.
thanks for being so patient with, the Zoom thing and how you just have to sort of sit there and watch me go through my paces
No,
here.
it was great. It was great.
Oh, okay.
okay.
I'm
Yeah, it
glad
was
to hear
really good.
that.
I
Okay,
never knew
well,
anything about that.
yeah, well, 2 years ago, I didn't either. Okay, well, I'm going to go and thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks
you.
again.
Have a nice night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Always a
Bye.
pleasure to hear you.
Thanks,
Bye.
Ralph.
Bye.